A week ago, on June 25th, NATO leaders agreed at their annual summit to a goal of spending 5% of their gross domestic product on defense, more than doubling the old 2% target. Sure, it's unclear how many members will actually reach this goal, which itself relies on some creative accounting. Of the 5%, only 3.5% is pledged to what they're calling pure defense, with the remainder going to security and defense-related critical infrastructure, your civil preparedness, your innovation, your defense industrial base, and whatnot. Just ahead of last week's NATO summit, The New Yorker published a story about collective security in NATO by contributing writer Joshua Yaffa, the author of the 2021 Orwell Prize-winning book, Between Two Fires: Truth, Ambition, and Compromise in Putin's Russia. Longtime listeners of the Naked Pravda may recall that he appeared on this show in May 2020, more than 5 years ago, to discuss that very book. Josh is currently the inaugural writer-in-residence at Bard College Berlin, and he was kind enough to speak with me about his new piece in The New Yorker. Welcome to the Naked Pravda. Howdy, folks. I'm Kevin Rothrock, the managing editor of Medusa in English and the host of this podcast. On this episode, I spoke to journalist and writer Joshua Yaffa about his recent New Yorker story, Collective Punishment: Why is Donald Trump upending America's commitment to NATO? In the article, Josh describes how the looming threats of Russian aggression and American withdrawal are pressuring European leaders to reassess their approach to NATO and the military in general. When I initially read the story, I came away thinking that European pledges to boost defense spending had actually halted Donald Trump's plans for disengagement from NATO. But Josh explained that it's not so simple. Listen for yourself. Here's the interview. Collective punishment is the print headline of this article, and I know that you selected it with your editor, obviously. But someone who's just seeing this very pretty picture of a, I would I would probably say, oh, it's a tank, but I know it's not a tank because I don't see like a big gun on it or whatever. But is it an armored vehicle of some kind? And the title is Collective Punishment. So like, what someone internalizing this very eloquent term, why does that capture something about this story for you?
It's a bit of a cop-out answer. I wish I had my wonderful and brilliant editor, Rob Fisher, on the line, who selected this headline, and I merely acquiesced to his pithy encapsulation of the piece's themes, but didn't generate it myself. But as I understand it, it's a bit of a pun, if that's the right term, and that it's a play on the idea of collective security, collective defense. Article 5, this core part or kind of essential component of NATO's whole raison d'etre, why it exists and what it's about, but bringing it up to date to the Trump era, in which Trump has been skeptical, if not outright hostile, to the idea of collective defense and the obligations that might put on the United States. He's said in different ways over the years, but repeatedly, some version of, if they don't pay, we won't defend them, about European members of NATO that don't contribute enough or what Trump deems enough in terms of funding their own defense and investing in defense. So this idea, I guess, that Trump would, in a sense, kind of punish NATO, punish the NATO allies for a lack of spending, or use that threat, really is what the piece ultimately describes. The specter or the possibility of that threat, Trump implicitly or explicitly suggesting that the U.S. in some way will lessen its responsibilities, as they've been historically, to propping up defense and deterrence in Europe, that actually spurs Europeans to act. That, in a way, is the big kind of theme of the piece.
Do you think that the Baltic state leaders, do they feel any consolation in the fact that, they're generally the ones who are spending higher percentages of their GDP, and so if you read Trump's threat sort of literally, it would not really apply to the states that are in the presumed warpath of like a Russian invasion? Or do they look at the general picture and they're like, we don't feel safe by everything that Trump's saying, even if like by the letter of what he's saying, they shouldn't be affected by that?
Well, there's a few different things going on here. In terms of this threat that Trump has made over the years, yes, it's a kind of absurd or just moot, in the sense that the countries most likely to be, as you put it, in the warpath, like that would be the first stops of any Russian invasion, are the
Yeah.
countries that are spending the most, in many cases, more than the US in terms of percentage of GDP. Poland is above 4% of GDP spent on defense. That's higher than the US, which is about 3.4%, I believe. Um, and it's countries like Spain that are yet to reach 2%, a pledge that NATO countries made more than a decade ago. So, according to Trump's logic, he might not come to the defense of Spain if it were to be attacked by Russia. But are we really
Right.
imagining a scenario in which Spain is attacked by Russia? So that is kind of more an obsession, a talking point and obsession of Trump's. It gets at what really irks him about NATO, and I think the whole idea of collective defense and treaty obligations writ large. This idea of kind of what the U.S. spends all this money, what does it get out of it? He's very transactional. I mean, all these things about Trump that and listeners know, and this idea
Mhm.
of, if they don't pay, we don't defend them. It's kind of more an expression of mood or worldview than it is, I think,
Mhm.
like a policy that was ever meant to be like precisely applied to this or that country.
Mhm.
But what does make countries in the Baltic region more nervous, Eastern Europe, the Eastern flank, as it's called in NATO parlance,
Right.
is a parallel process that's actually much more real than Trump's kind of imagined or hypothetical threat. And that is the notion, which seems like it's happening, that the U.S. will be withdrawing troops, equipment, its military capabilities, as they're called, from Europe, and from these kind of frontline Eastern flank countries. There was a surge that really began in 2014 after annexation of Crimea and war in Donbass, but really accelerated after 2022 with the full-scale invasion. After 2022, 20,000 additional U.S. troops were deployed in Eastern Europe, this Eastern flank, as NATO calls it. And some of them are likely coming home or going to be reassigned, redeployed to other theaters, Asia, Middle East. And so there's a lot of things going on in terms of the Trump administration's policy toward NATO and European security. This obsession over Article 5 is important. I mean, that is the clause that, makes the whole NATO machine function. But that, as I said, is a kind of more of an obsession or talking point of Trump's. But the thing about repositioning military forces and equipment, that is happening. I mean, the Pentagon is undergoing a force posture review, global posture review. And at the end of that, by all accounts, they're going to, the U.S. military leadership is going to move men and material, as it's called, men and women and equipment out of the European theater, move it to other theaters. And that, I think, is what makes European allies nervous. It's the unknown, most of anything in life, right? That's kind of the most scary, when you don't know neither the pace nor the scale at which that stuff is going to be withdrawn. You can start to feel pretty nervous, or as one diplomat told me who works on NATO issues, a European diplomat, it allows people to come up with all sorts of their own dark fantasies.
So that's still the vibe you get, is that America's on its way out, or at least that the 2014 surge is sort of going to be winding down. Because I got the impression, as the article ends, is that sort of all the posturing that the Trump administration has done, kind of they got what they wanted in terms of pledges, so to speak, and that they were now going to kind of sit pat. That's not the prediction you would make.
Again, there's sort of multiple processes happening at once. Yes, like, I don't think Trump is going to blow up NATO. There's this scene in the piece. I mean, it just happens. It's a scene in real life that's described in the piece from 2018 at the NATO summit in Brussels, when, according to then National Security Advisor John Bolton, other Trump officials, or officials in that first Trump administration, Trump was like on the verge of just pulling the U.S. out of NATO. Like, fuck it, we're out. I'm not getting what I want,
Yeah.
or at least was going to, like, no joke, threatened to do so. I mean, really, call my bluff, I dare you, sort of thing.
Yeah.
And That doesn't seem to be the case anymore. Indeed, I think Trump has a different attitude toward NATO. Trump officials, these are not like liberal internationalists who just suddenly believe in the value of alliances per se. No, but I think that they've come to see that if Europe is willing to shoulder more of the burden, to pay more for its own defense, to invest in capabilities so it can actually do more for its own defense and doesn't rely on the US in a lot of key ways, that can actually be a useful and kind of helpful arrangement for the US to be in. It frees the US up to go do things in Asia, first and foremost, until Iran happened, the kind of strategic obsession, not just of this administration, but of many administrations before it, the pivot to Asia that never quite happened. This collection of Trump officials seemed intent on making happen. So I think that the degree to which the other allies have stepped up and at least paid lip service to this 5% of GDP pledge, that's what came out of the Hague summit, that is enough, more than enough, to make Trump feel like he got a win, and he did get a win. His sustained pressure on this point is the thing that single-handedly brought the NATO allies around to this number. They wouldn't have gone this big if it wasn't for Trump. Another question is, did they go just this big for Trump and have no intention of really following through on that over the next decade? And it's another number that's not going to be met,
right,
like a lot of the other numbers. And what they needed to do was just basically quiet the beast, give Trump what he wants for now. He'll move on to other interests and other obsessions, forget about NATO for a while, and kind of the status quo can continue. There's an element of that, I think. And I think there's also some strategic questions about, what does NATO become when it is, to a certain extent, kind of taken over by the mission of acquiescing, at least in a kind of performative way, to the whims and demands of one man. It's meant to be a strategic defense alliance that is looking at scenarios, likely scenarios, coming up with capability targets to match those scenarios, not just following numbers pulled out of a hat by the US president. But the fact that those numbers were announced, you can see it pleases Trump. He said as much. And it is, in a way, an undeniable diplomatic win for him. But this parallel process, it happens because of those large investments. And no matter what, even if it doesn't get to 5% or this 3.5% on core military spending and 1.5% on related infrastructure, even if the European allies or most of them don't get to that number fully or soon, what's undeniable is there is a whole lot of money being spent on defense and military matters in Europe at a scale that wasn't the case a few years ago. That's I'm talking to now in Germany, which canceled the so-called or removed the so-called debt brake on its fiscal spending some months ago, opening up floodgates for almost unlimited numbers of amount of military spending. It's going to be in the hundreds of billions of euros for sure. And things like that are happening across the continent. And all of that procurement and all of that attention to military matters and building up militaries that had been allowed to grow a bit fallow over the years means that Europe can take on more responsibility. It will have some of the capabilities that so far have been uniquely held by the US and Europe. And that means that the US, or rather, knowing that the US is going to be withdrawing forces from Europe, that's all the more reason for Europe to step up and develop those capabilities. So Trump isn't going to blow up NATO, but NATO is slowly going to become a bit more European. It's not going to be the US that is in the military driver's seat and therefore in the political driver's seat. Those capabilities and responsibilities are going to be handed over to Europe. The Trump administration is super explicit about that.
And as the Europeans do more for their own security and have to sort of step up to roles that were previously held or dominated by the United States, are there lots of analogies to American experiences with military spending? Because presumably they're looking a lot to the United States for what they're going to have to do since the U.S. was the one doing many of these things. And I wonder, are they looking at like Reaganism or Keynesianism or like, I know Keynes is not an American, but like the concepts and so on, are they, I don't think Keynes was American, was he? I thought he was British. Anyway, not important. What I'm saying is like, are they looking back at America's experience and is any of it either aspirational or cautionary Are they looking to like avoid certain things that have happened with the U.S. or looking to repeat them? Or how much is American experience part of the conversation as to what Europe has to do now?
Well, they're certainly aware that military spending at that scale is something highly political and needs to be explained and justified to democratic voting publics. Um, and there are a number of implications that grow out of that. One is, where does this money go? Air defense is a key system that Europe is really lacking. I mentioned this in the piece, but I was at this defense and security conference in Estonia, and I was totally surprised that at this like open on the record forum, I guess he's the chief of defense. I mean, the top military officer of the Netherlands, the kind of equivalent of the U.S. chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, on a panel said that Netherlands had something like, I think, 3 Patriot air missile defense systems, and that in an event of war, this military chief would use them to defend the port of Rotterdam, because that has all sorts of strategic significance. That's where material and equipment would be coming in and out of or into, and he wouldn't use them to defend Amsterdam. Sorry, basically. Sorry, Amsterdam, but like, you're not getting any air defense. And the point of that story, it wasn't necessarily to frighten the people of Amsterdam, but to just drive home the deficit and how acute this deficit
Scarcity,
was. Yeah. And so air defense is like a particular problem in Europe, and that's something that a capability that the U.S. historically has provided. And so question for something like air defense is, well, do we just like throw a lot of money at the problem and try and buy as many U.S. Patriot systems as we can? That's a system we know that works. It's like, rolling off the assembly line. Another question, there's huge backlog for Patriot systems. So like, it's actually a system that like money can't necessarily buy, in the sense of, great, like, thanks for your hundreds of millions, but like, get in line. Maybe you can have one in 5 years.
Right.
But the alternative is to develop, and there are some European air defense systems, but they're not necessarily being built at scale. Do you throw a lot of money at, or you have the chance, right? It's actually an opportunity to build up a whole industry inside Europe, keep jobs in Europe, keep investment in Europe. So that's something that Europeans are weighing. And also the Trump administration, it's a bit of like, can you really have your cake and eat it too? The Trump administration has told Europeans, like, you need to rearm. You need to spend all this money on defense. We're watching. We want you to hit these pledges. And also, by the way, you should buy American weapons. And, there's some tension around that. And the Europeans are like, okay, like, we agree with the first part for our own reasons. We agree with the threat assessment. We have our own calculations of the threat assessment. We need to rearm. We need to gain these capabilities. But like, the politics of this are such that like, we can't just be sending all that money to the US. Like, we have to build up our own industries, develop these weapons, create factories, create jobs, create programs here in Europe. Though that then leads to another so far unsolved or unresolved conundrum, which is like, are there going to be 30 different air defense systems across Europe? Like, that probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Politically, how does that work? Imagine the debates that happen inside U.S. military procurement as one state, U.S. state or another, is like fighting for the new factory, or like fighting to develop the new multi-billion-dollar weapon system for the Pentagon. Think about all the money, all the jobs that go into, Kentucky versus Florida versus California. Well, when you're dealing with actually sovereign independent states, that becomes even more difficult to manage. Are there going to be 30 tanks, 30 armored personnel carriers, 30 fighter aircraft? I mean, clearly there can't be. Something like fighter aircraft is just too expensive and complicated for every country to develop on their own. And most countries in Europe actually buy the U.S. F-35. But there's a whole lot of unresolved questions about how you actually handle the procurement of all of this military stuff. And we're talking about hundreds of billions, trillions of euros in aggregate. And politically, that's money that you can't just spend kind of without a policy, kind of domestic policy thrust behind it. And that's something that the Europeans haven't fully figured out how they're going to manage.
You were referring to the need for a domestic policy thrust, and part of that is obviously overcoming the balkanization of Europe's defense industry and how you can't have a dozen or multiple dozens of different weapon systems. They need to be standardized, and presumably the manufacturers need to be consolidated to rival anybody like a U.S. defense contractor or something like that. But the other side of this, and this is I think what you're referring to when you use the word domestic, is that increasing increasing military spending will unless you're going to just spend purely in deficit, and I assume there'll be some of that, but I imagine the appetite is not infinite. Eventually you'll have to be cutting down on social spending, and I assume this is also kind of a thread in a lot of American right-wing commentary. It's like, you guys have universal health care and la-di-da, and we have to protect you, and now you've got to cut some of that frou-frou spending, and because we're not going to be there to be your muscle anymore. And so to what degree is that captured the reality, and to what degree do you find that it's actually a part of the conversation that you witness when you're at these NATO events and so on?
Well, inside NATO itself, NATO diplomats, military officials, people who work in that building, they're not necessarily trying to like sell these policies to the average German or Belgian or whatever. I mean, they're really looking at first, as I mentioned, the kind of threat scenarios and how they see the threat picture in Europe, and then what are the capabilities Europe needs to defend itself. So they're really looking at it from a kind of military technical perspective. They're already bought into the idea that Europe needs to have a kind of homegrown, self-sufficient means of defending itself. And so what are the capabilities needed to do so? But yeah, where I live in Berlin, I can see it's an issue, and it's an issue across Europe. Look at why Spain, for example, almost threatened to kind of blow up this whole agreement that happened at The Hague around increased spending. Spain's still not quite at 2%, an agreement that was reached among the NATO members more than a decade ago. And that's because there's a lot of difficult budget math across Europe. And spending this much on military procurement isn't necessarily popular in every European country. Of course, it's different in different places. In the Baltics and Poland, as far as I can tell, there seems to be real societal buy-in as to why these countries need robust, strong, as self-sufficient as possible militaries. Though, I mean, in the Baltics, you're not ever really going to get, and nor do they aspire to or imagine they need a truly self-sufficient military. As I report in the piece, when I was visited some exercises in Estonia, one of the Estonian officers there reminded me that there's no such thing as Estonian defense plans and NATO defense plans. There are only NATO defense plans that include Estonia. But in other countries, there are real debates. Countries that have historically had really robust social welfare states, although kind of obvious ones, across Europe. With Germany, maybe they don't face this dilemma immediately because they removed this so-called debt brake, which, as you alluded to, kind of allows them to go into deficit to borrow to spend more on military procurement. So like no one's losing their German state health plan tomorrow because they're buying more Leopard tanks. But in general, like there's the shift in mood, right? Even if it's not actually a kind of one in, one out budget calculation, of course, polities react to a shift in priority, a shift in rhetoric. And that is something that national governments have to be sensitive to. And one issue that came up in my reporting in Brussels and around Europe was a fear of, what happens when, or question about when the war in Ukraine hopefully ends, or at least has a kind of long interregnum where there's a significant drop in the intensity of fighting, and a number of things could happen then. But one thing that could happen is that the urgency of the threat could start to feel less real and less acute. Like when the biggest land war in Europe in many, many decades is no longer burning as hot, do publics and politicians in Europe start to feel like, okay, we kind of like, dodged one here. Russia somehow no longer looks as big and scary, or like Russia's no longer on the march. So I guess we can kind of dial down that big, burst of spending we had planned on. Another question is, on what terms do U.S. Russian, or really more specifically Trump Putin relations develop? And is it tenable for the U.S. to continue to hammer and push Europeans to spend more, to hit this 5% target, to take over all these responsibilities, to invest heavily in the military, if, for example, the U.S. under the Trump administration essentially treats Russia more as a partner than a great threat, right? If Russia's not this huge threat, says Trump, then why should you listen to Trump on this other point about spending unprecedented amounts of national wealth on military to protect against Russia? Like, does that begin to be a kind of logical paradox that rubs European voters and politicians the wrong way? That's another open question.
When talking about planning for NATO's future, from what you've witnessed and what you know, what exactly are the differences in decision making and influence, public influence, let's say, between like the political leaders of the European member states and the NATO bureaucracy? Because I know that NATO kind of exists as its own entity in lots of ways, and it has its own institutional momentum. And I know that some critics of like NATO expansion will argue that it was NATO bureaucracy that was sort of pushing itself eastward, and that like the populace of Europe wasn't necessarily consulted at every step, that it was sort of, it had its own kind of momentum. Is that something that you see in practice, or is it more complicated than that? It's there's really the NATO leadership has to respond directly to the member political leadership and so on. Like, are there multiple vectors here of influence, or is there one side kind of leading the show?
I think you have to talk about kind of NATO pre-Trump or NATO outside of Trump. Trump's been around twice now. And so outside of a Trump context, I think there is something to the fact that NATO as an institution, as a historical fact of our post-war reality, became just part of like the, basic architecture of the global security, certainly of European security, and wasn't necessarily examined or re-examined critically, and maybe took on a kind of force of inertia. I'm not sure that's necessarily true with expansion. I think that there were real players pushing hard for expansion. Certainly the states in Baltic region, Eastern and Central Europe that joined in the 90s, they really wanted it, right? It wasn't just like NATO, just like a ooze, just kind of, seeped into their territories. And they're like, well, now that this, ooze is here, fine, we'll open the door for it. No, they were really pushing hard for that. And in the case, now I'm switching a bit, but 2008 Bucharest summit, the famous Bucharest summit that established this irreversible, as it's called, path toward membership for Ukraine. That was something really being pushed uniquely and kind of unilaterally almost by the Bush administration. Also, the countries in Eastern Central Europe wanted it very much. Ukraine was on board. Though interestingly, people of Ukraine at the time, you look at various polls, it was unclear how popular NATO membership was. But in any case, there were real players inside NATO pushing for that, including the most powerful player of all, the United States. So no, I think that, yes, there's some institutional momentum and inertia around NATO. Like, there's just a thing that people have kind of grown up with and assume is there and will always be there. But the whims, priorities, desires of member states is what really drives the organization. I mean, you see that now with the way, for example, Secretary General Mark Rutte behaves and treats Trump. I mean, in a way, it's so much good material came out of the Hague Summit. My piece was written, edited, closed, and published before the Hague Summit. It was meant to be a kind of curtain raiser for the Hague Summit, but at the Hague Summit, Rutte was really in fine form, especially with this line that immediately went viral of Rutte basically calling Trump daddy. What does he say?
The other team, the other group, Iran, said, let's stop this. And you know what? Israel said it too. Very smart. They fought like hell, and then they said, let's stop. And they're going to build themselves. And I really see it as sticking. I mean, we may do papers on it, Marco. Maybe we're going to do papers. I don't even know if you need them. They're not going to be fighting each other. They've had it. They've had a big fight, like two kids in a schoolyard. They fight like hell. You can't stop them. Let them fight for about 2-3 minutes, then it's easy to stop them.
And then Daddy has to sometimes use strong language to
You have
get
to use
stuff.
strong language. Every once in a while, you have to use a certain word.
He tried to walk it back a little bit later, although
I don't know
sure
who
how
else he could be
successfully.
referring to, if you look at the context.
Right. Yeah.
Or this text message that Trump published.
Yeah, that Trump
that
posted.
Ruta sent him. That was just over the top, totally just obsequious, full of the highest praise for Trump. And I observed Ruta over some months in Brussels at various meetings. We had an interview one-on-one at the
That's right.
residence, and he just goes out. It's just clear that I mean, who am I to call it a performance, right? I mean, Ruta himself, you can pin him to the wall and he'll swear it's all genuine and it all has to do with, look at what Trump's actually doing for the alliance and look, the effect he's having. And that's all true. It's hard to argue with him on facts. It's hard to kind of prove that, no. I know that you're, doing this just to kind of butter up the American president because you think that that's what's required of you. And maybe it is. And there are plenty of people in and around NATO, diplomats from other NATO member countries positioned in Brussels or elsewhere around Europe who said some version of, may not always kind of look great, or Ruta might sound like he's kind of veering into quasi sycophancy, but actually that's what we need him to do. The truth is we need the US in the alliance. What European states are trying to do, among other things, is manage the speed and scale of the US withdrawal from Europe. So in that sense, you need Trump to be happy. You need Trump to feel good. You don't want to anger Trump and have him decide in a flash, 2018 style, well, that's it. Then screw you guys, I'm out of here. That would create huge security gaps for Europe. So they need this to be, they're trying to slow roll the process, basically. They're on board that it's happening. I think maybe some European states might think they could still stop the process or kind of prevent U.S. troops from leaving in big numbers. But I think most European states know that that's happening. The question is but how fast is that happening? Do we get enough time to prepare? Do we get enough time to build up our own militaries and have our own capabilities? So what we need Ruta to do is sorry, man, but we need you to go in there, butter Trump up, flatter him, whatever, all the tools we see Ruta deploying so that Trump feels good, has a good vibe about NATO, doesn't blow up at us and kind of lets us develop our own capabilities on a realistic timeline.
As you mentioned already in this interview, for the article, you spent some time in Estonia observing some NATO military exercises that were modeling a kind of small-scale Russian incursion. And I know that this has been theorized to be one of the likeliest sort of ways that Russia could test collective security in the NATO bloc. And I wondered, did you get the sense that the soldiers that you were seeing, did they feel kind of prepared? Were the vibes good, or was it fearful? Because I know that this is a lot of people don't feel like NATO's ready for this, and you got to see kind of how they're preparing, and I wonder, what did it feel
I have
like?
to say that the Estonian, the vibes always seem good inside the Estonian Defense Forces, to the extent I could tell, right? I think that there's something about that country or the countries in that region that they've kind of grown up with this. I mean, they're not going to sort of frighten easily at oh, Russia could invade, really? Is that could happen? Right? They're not kind of suddenly wide-eyed at this realization that such a threat exists. I think I mentioned this in the piece. One of the Estonian officers I talked to, I think 3 out of his 4 grandparents were born in exile or had been deported to Siberia. Basically, most of his family actually only returned to Estonia in the 70s. And just those sorts of stories are in every family. And there's no kind of illusions about the nature of the threat as they perceive it. And, a lot of progress has been made. There's a lot of stories and tales, anecdotes in the piece of kind of bumbling, inefficiency, lack European capability, all the ways that Europe relied on the US to do basic stuff. But a lot of that is changing, and I don't want to give short shrift to that, to the degree to which European militaries have made an effort to step up their capabilities, do things like, airlift logistics, and also on air defense, like I mentioned earlier. So a lot of stuff is coming online quickly. And I got the sense that the militaries I observed, not just the Estonian military, I was with Americans, French, Finns, uh, that they have a kind of pep in their step, as it were. How warranted, justified, I don't know. And the other big question is like, well, first we're assuming that there will be some sort of Russian incursion invasion of the Baltics, which is like a huge if, and it may very well never happen.
Yeah.
And one point that Ruta, other NATO officials make is like, we're actually spending this money so as to convince Russia to never try such a thing. Like a sign of our success will be that Putin never tries anything because he'll see how much we've built up our defense capabilities. So then you get into the territory of proving a negative becomes very difficult, but like that is in fact the first and foremost aim of all of this military activity and procurement is to convince Russia that it's not worth trying in the first place.
Do you get the sense that NATO leaders are like observing the minutia of Russian defense policy and that they're responding to that publicly? I mean, obviously they're observing it, but do you get the sense that that is sort of influencing and directing how what they're doing, I don't know, military in terms of military policy in Europe, or is it mostly just the big stuff? Like, well, they invaded Ukraine, they're still fighting the war there. Trump is backing away, and that these are kind of these two overarching reasons to force a change in policy, or are they looking and saying, okay, well, they've moved some troops here, we need to counter and have more guys here? Like, I guess it's happening at every level, but like, what was the more? Did you get a sense that like they're really mirroring Russian actions, or is Russia just this kind of like silent boogeyman beyond the hills that's all they need to know at this point?
Yeah, you answered your own question in a way that it's kind of all a mix of everything. I mean, the big inside the NATO headquarters, the big motivating factors are the ones you named. Like there is this Russia threat. We don't know what form it will take. We don't know the exact timeline, but clearly, the Russian army is bigger now than it was at the moment it invaded Ukraine. Like despite all of the losses to manpower and equipment, and with the Russian economy on this war footing, it's able to produce all these munitions. Like, there's this formidable military machine, and kind of, in Chekhovian style, like if, the gun is on the wall in the first act, like, does it go off in the second? Like Ukraine has shown that Russia's certainly willing to use this military power. It's like, it's not just for show, right? It's not just to be a kind of stick wielded in diplomatic negotiations. Russia's really willing to invade. Will it? Where will it do so? On what time horizon? Big open questions. But that's enough to get a lot of Europe thinking seriously about defense. And the second point you also mentioned, which is in parallel, Trump is talking about lessening the U.S. backstop to security in Europe. So you combine those two, it spurs a whole lot of action. And then yes, you do have people, some maybe different people than the ones thinking about those high level issues, thinking about, okay, Russia has created the Leningrad military district for a reason. That means they're thinking about war in Northwest Russia. Well, what does that implicate? Finland, Baltics, and so on. But that's a question for military officials who, as I understand it, are mirroring to a certain extent, or keeping in mind, where are the Russian troop deployments on the Russian side of the border? Where should the NATO troop deployments be on the NATO side of the border? I mean, yeah, those are naturally issues people are thinking about, but like the focus of my piece and what I picked up on in Brussels was people really chewing over the bigger strategic questions about NATO's future and the future of security and defense in Europe.
Are you aware of any continued conversations between Russian military leaders and NATO military leaders? I know that they, in the past, they had like a direct kind of like, I forget what it was called, but they actually met together and they spoke and they were in conversation.
Right. NATO-Russia Council.
That's the one. For obvious reasons, we're not hearing from, the Russian counterparts for the Europeans and the Americans you identify in your story. But I wonder, like, do you have a sense of like these people you're talking to understand their Russian counterparts, or is it like a There are black box over there, because that would to me would be kind of scary if like neither side's in any conversation anymore.
Yeah, I don't know. There certainly isn't kind of official channels of communications that I'm aware of. Um, I think what is guiding strategic thinking in NATO and Brussels and also around Europe is this idea of, we don't know, or rather, I'm just going to reveal my own analysis or bias here. I don't think Putin has made up his mind about invading a Baltic country, challenging Article 5, challenging NATO. I don't think we're like locked into that outcome, and Putin is just, steadily every morning puts a X, through a day of the calendar and like countdown to the day I've decided ahead of time I'm going to invade NATO. Just like was the case in Ukraine, clearly at a certain point, whether it was a year before the invasion, 6 months, I mean, there was a point well in advance of the invasion in which Putin seems to have decided that that's what's happening and all that last minute diplomacy was a ruse. Like there was a moment when Putin said or decided this is happening. But, I'm skeptical of those narrations, kind of post factum narrations of the war that set the inevitability of the 2022 invasion, 2014, 2018, even maybe 2020, right? Like there were still so many different outcomes possible. And that's not to like let Russia off the hook. I mean, I'm not attaching a value judgment to that. It's just that Putin could have not invaded, or he could have invaded differently, or he could have gotten what he wanted through other means. And I believe that something like that is the case here. That Putin, this is what a high-ranking European intelligence officer told me, and I quote in the piece, that the assessment of this agency is that Putin does have a settled strategy of weakening and undermining NATO. I mean, none of this is like so revelatory, right? I'm not giving you like some top secret briefing, but rather, I think, pretty obvious understanding of the way Putin thinks and sees the world. And that, yeah, he has the strategic interest in weakening and undermining NATO. That's the strategy. What are the tactics, though? Does he do that by like lopping off a bit of territory of a Baltic country and kind of forcing NATO, like, I dare you to come try and take it back, present NATO with a fait accompli? Are you going to risk this huge war to get back, 30 square kilometers of a Baltic country? If you do, that's huge war. If you don't, then, Article 5 is worthless. Will he do it through, hoping that, as he kind of seems to keep hoping in Ukraine will happen and doesn't, that in the Ukraine case, that Ukraine will somehow collapse from within, that the military will become exhausted, the population will grow tired of war. There'll be some kind of like internal revolt to get rid of Zelensky, and like some new, more pro-Russian or sympathetic to Russian governing force will come into power. And like Putin will have gotten what he wanted without having to take Kiev with tanks. That's probably what he'd like to have happen in Europe too. Basically, he gets his way. A bunch of kind of NATO skeptic populist parties take power that don't want to spend all this money on military stuff and don't see Russia as a threat, and they kind of dial it all back, and Putin gets what he wants without having to like send little green men to Narva. But if, as in the case in Ukraine, he's not able to get what he wants through these means of kind of political subterfuge, he's ready to send little green men or much more into Estonia. That's also totally live possibility that I allow for, but I don't think we're on a path in which that is inevitable.
Do you have time for one last question?
Yep.
One more question about the U.S. and its role in NATO. Throughout the story, the New Yorker story that we're talking about that you wrote, you point out ways in which Trump's NATO position sort of falls on a continuum of American skepticism or American hesitancy to get too entangled or more entangled or perpetually entangled in Europe. And even in this interview, you've said that Europeans have kind of by and large come to agree with the sort of future of the alliance as Trump has always described it, which is one with less of a U.S. leadership. But at the same time, or maybe not, let's cancel that segue. Not at the same time, but a lot of Americans are very reluctant. The non-MAGA Americans are very reluctant to see Trump on any continuum of American history or future. And I mean, even his successor, the guy that was initially elected to replace him, was one of the biggest sort of NATO cheerleaders we've had in a long time. But I'm talking about Biden, obviously. And I know that we could say that he's an exception, I guess, to the continuum. But in your view, in the view of many of the European sources that you speak to, does Trump seem like he's sort of the fulfillment of what's come before him, or is he an aberration? Is there hope that the next one will be more of a transatlantis or whatever, or is the expectation that this is the future to come?
I think that Trump 2.0, people realize like this isn't just an aberration we can wait out and then hope that the status quo ante returns, as it did like spectacularly with Biden. I mean, it was just, in terms of transatlanticism, like you couldn't think of a more glorious return to the, past historical continuum than Biden, who just was like oozed transatlanticism, perhaps, more than any other living American politician. And maybe that was in a way kind of bad or counterproductive for the health of the alliance in a way, right? And that it was kind of lulled into a false confidence. But this time around, I think people in Europe get that like something fundamental and real is happening, and they can't just, it has to be about more than just paying Trump lip service. Like, okay, let's just, placate this guy and hope we can go back to the way things were in a few years. But that's also a function of the fact that like Europeans fundamentally agree with the notion that it's high time for Europe to become more capable and self-sufficient in matters of defense and security. That's like that is in Europe's own interest. It's like that it's beyond just what like Trump is asking them to do, cajoling, threatening them to do, like whatever. That's like that's an issue that Europe has to deal with because they need to like manage the security relationship with the US. That's the luxury of letting that blow up in their faces. But like whatever, that's like not the reason at its core why Europe is spending all this money to build up its military power and military capabilities. It's doing that because Europe, for its own reasons and on its own merits, has decided that that's strategically necessary and important. And so I think that something has been set in motion that's, yes, Trump in a way provided a certain degree of urgency, but these are processes that now are much bigger than Trump, and kind of no matter what comes next in terms of a US president after Trump will outlive the Trump presidency. And lots of Europeans have told me some version of like, yeah, sometimes it can be unpleasant. I'm talking about like Trump's rhetoric, or like JD Vance, we didn't talk about this, like haranguing Europeans at the Munich conference for kind of being anti-democratic in Vance's reading and squelching free speech, not essentially kind of giving way to the rise of the kind of far-right populist movements that Vance himself embodies and would like to see come to power in Europe. Like, that's not pleasant for like the ruling elite in Europe to have to sit and listen to. Way that kind of turns them off from some of the Trump messaging. But at the same time, like I've now said in multiple ways, like that doesn't really cancel the logic of why they understand they have to rearm and develop these military capabilities. So there's a sense of like, yeah, sometimes the presentation makes us feel uncomfortable, or it's like it's not nice. They're not being nice. Like, historically, yeah, people in NATO are always nice to each other, and like these guys, they're not always nice. But, and it's not even that like they're right. It's not like they're not nice, but damn it, they're right. It's like, yeah, sometimes they cannot be nice, but like this is a thing that has to happen. It's not even about them being right. It's just like this is objectively a scenario that we have to pursue. Like it's time for us to arm. It's time for us to develop our militaries. It's time to kind of stand on our own 2 feet in terms of defense. That has to happen regardless of whether like Vance is being mean to us or not. But him being mean to us also, frankly, does kind of light a fire under our ass.